Hi, I'm Guy Harris. Welcome to Talk Like a Leader. This week's episode is titled Getting Past Your Filters, Fundamental Attribution Error. This episode continues a series of episodes that are drawn from the ideas at therulesofcivilconversation.org. And at therulesofcivilconversation.org, they propose 8 rules of civil conversation. I'm now up to rule number 4 for this week. In the last couple of weeks, I've looked at some other rules for how to have civil conversations, and I've looked at 4 of the many logical fallacies we can have that interfere with our ability to troubleshoot, problem solve, communicate clearly when we're working with other people. I didn't look at all of the logical fallacies. I did look at 4 and showed how they can affect our communication as leaders. This week, I'm shifting my focus to biases, and the specific bias I'm going to talk about today is fundamental attribution error. It's the idea that when we look at other people and evaluate their behaviors and results, particularly how their behaviors and results affect us, when their behaviors and results are some way negative, we assign negative personal characteristics to the person, meaning they got bad results or they behaved in a way that affected us negatively, and we assign that to some kind of flaw or challenge in their basic character, their personality traits, their work ethic, their honesty, those kind of things. So we get negative behaviors or results, and we assume negative things about their character, their work ethic, their honesty. While at the same time, we tend to justify our own mistakes and missteps and problems, things that we do that might have had a negative impact on another person. We try to explain that away based on the circumstances. So when we look at other people, we tend to ignore situational or circumstantial effects on a person's behavior and assign it almost entirely to character. And when we look at ourselves, we ignore character traits and blame it all on circumstances. I've heard it described as a tendency to judge others by their behaviors, judge their character by their behaviors, and judge ourselves by our intent. And it creates a challenge. Because of a bias, because of fundamental attribution error and other biases we'll look at in other episodes, we can violate rule number 4 of the rules of civil conversation. And rule number 4 is stated this way: I will attempt to account for my personal or my own biases, and I will try, or at least attempt, to be intellectually humble. Now, the second part of that statement, the intellectually humble part, basically says that if I'm unwilling to look at my own biases, or if I hear about the biases and I just ignore them and I say, well, those don't apply to me, I'm not being intellectually humble, because the truth is biases apply to all of us. We all have biases. Now, we may have different ones to different degrees, and we have to be intellectually humble to look at and confront those biases so we can figure out ways to get past them. And I present this not as a criticism necessarily, it's more of an observation. We all of us as human beings have biases, have holes in our thinking. And if we're not aware of them, we can't take steps to correct them. We can't protect ourselves from the negative impact of these biases. And that's the idea, is to look at fundamental attribution error, this idea that we judge others by their behaviors and assign negative characteristics to them when they have negative behaviors, and judge ourselves by intent and say, well, we meant well, even if it didn't turn out well. And as a result, we fail in our communication with other people. We make errors in judgment and errors in communication because of this bias. So let's look at how this affects our communication. I'll share some examples of how this can creep into our thinking and what it sounds like either in the words we say or in the thoughts we have. For example, being late for a meeting. When another person is late for a meeting, we might say something like this: well, you know what? They're kind of irresponsible, or they don't plan very well. And we assign some kind of character judgment to them, or ability or skill judgment to them for this behavior of being late to a meeting. Yet when we're late to a meeting, we might say something like, well, there was too much traffic. So for others, we assign it to something about their character or their intelligence or their skill. And to ourselves, we assign it to circumstances or the situation. Another example, let's say we miss a work deadline. When it's another person, we might say something like this: well, they just can't manage their time. They don't have the skill of managing their time, or they don't care. So we assign it to some level of their connection or concern for the organization. Or even worse, we'll say something like, well, they're just kind of lazy. So we assign it to basic work ethic kind of values. Or, they're really just kind of irresponsible. So we assign it to a characteristic about the person because they missed a deadline. Yet if we miss a deadline, we might say something like, well, I just had too many things to do, or I didn't have the right information or tools, or, they didn't give me enough time. Or maybe we'd say something like, they weren't really clear on what they wanted. So when we fail to meet a deadline, we'll assign it to some kind of external circumstance. Another example, we make a mistake. We make an error on a report or have something go wrong in our work product. For another person, we might say something like, well, they're kind of careless or they're sloppy. They're really just not very smart. So we assign it to fundamental attributes about the person. Whereas if we make a mistake, we might say something like this: well, I've never done this before, and mistakes are part of the learning process. Or say, they just didn't give me the right information or the right instructions. They didn't tell me. I didn't know. So we explain it away as a circumstantial or situational kind of thing. Let's look at miscommunications. And so let's start with a situation where maybe we didn't understand something another person wanted us to understand. And we say things like, they didn't tell me. We make it their fault, or that's not what they said, or they didn't send the email. We assign fault to the other person because there was a breakdown in communication. Or if maybe they didn't understand something we said, we go the other way and say, well, I told them, or I sent the email, or they should have known. So when we don't understand things, we make it the other person's fault. And when they don't understand things, we make it the other person's fault. So we're assigning some kind of character flaw or failure in the other person when there's a breakdown in communication. And a strategy for getting past this bias in all these situations is at least 2 steps. And I'm going to offer this as an idea. I acknowledge that there might actually be other ways to do this, other strategies. There's just 2 that I found that are very helpful. And one is to use I statements and thinking. I'll explain what that means in a minute. I statements and thinking. And when we're looking at another person's behaviors, consider the situation and the circumstances the other person was in or is in to the best of your ability. And as you evaluate the results, find or look for the most charitable or most positive or most optimistic interpretation you can of how they responded in the situation. Now, this observation may or may not be accurate. It does help you stay out of communication missteps, though. So use I statements and consider the most charitable or optimistic or positive outlook for how the circumstances affected them or how they responded to the circumstances they were in when you look at their behaviors and results. So there's some starting points. Now, I offer these, by the way, before I get back to the examples and talk about how we could redo those with more of a getting past my bias sort of thinking. Let me offer a caveat for everything I'm saying here. I recognize that there are situations where we interact with or connect with, communicate with, work with people who have a pattern of behavior that consistently creates bad results or bad impact. I recognize that. And I would say that that's a different situation than what I'm attempting to address today. Don't have nearly enough time in this brief podcast episode to go into all the different ways and all the different subtlety and all the different situations we could find ourselves in. I'm really addressing primarily those single, more isolated events where something goes wrong and where we feel tempted to fill in the blank in understanding with some kind of negative assumption about the other person. So if we have a situation where there's a consistently negative result or behavior, that's a different discussion. And even in those situations, I would recommend still focusing on the behaviors and results rather than looking at or thinking about or talking about the person's character, work ethic, motivation, anything like that. Stay away from that the best you can because it's not likely to go well. So are there situations where patterns of behavior become a problem or individual behaviors are so bad they significantly negatively impact the business or organization or you? Yes, they happen. And even in those cases, attempt as best you can to apply what I'm talking about here. I think it'll still make your communication more effective and more clear. Okay, so let's go back to the examples and think about some ways we could look at getting past our bias and thinking about them. So say a person's late for a meeting. Rather than say they're irresponsible or they didn't plan properly, maybe you could say, maybe they ran into some kind of delay. So you're leaving open the possibility that it was a circumstantial issue that affected them, not some kind of character flaw. And then for yourself, this is using I statements and taking responsibility for yourself. When you're late for a meeting, rather than explaining it away with there was too much traffic, then at least to yourself, say something like this, I didn't plan for traffic properly so that I can do better next time. The idea is to do better next time and take responsibility for the situation rather than to shift the blame to the circumstance. That doesn't imply that there's a character flaw in you. That means in this moment, I didn't plan enough time, and in the future, I'd like to do better. Okay, another example, missing a work deadline. Well, instead of looking at another person who misses a work deadline and say, well, they can't manage their time, or they don't care, or they're lazy, or they're irresponsible, or some kind of negative character assessment, maybe you could consider situational factors that might be affecting them. You could say something like this, or you could even just thinking it can help you communicate more clearly. There's probably a good reason why they missed that deadline. Something must have happened that got in their way, or they ran into a challenge that I'm not aware of. So you're looking for a way to explain it that leaves open the possibility for conversation rather than judging the other person's character. Now, when I miss a work deadline, it's kind of like the being late for a meeting thing. I want to think more responsibly about it. And rather than justify it away by saying I had too many things to do, or I didn't have the right information or tools, or they didn't tell me, or they didn't make their expectations clear, kind of shifting the blame somewhere, I want to look for what I could do to have done better in that situation so that I can do better in the future. I might think or say something like this, I probably could have planned better there. I maybe could have anticipated those challenges a little better. Or, frankly, I lost track of time and I need to come up with some kind of planning system that helps me anticipate those challenges better. Or maybe I should have asked for more information so I had better clarity about what I was trying to do. So I'm trying to look for what could I have done to make it better in the situation rather than shifting the blame and trying to justify it away. Okay, next example. We make a mistake. When we're looking at other people, remember, we might say things like they're careless, they're sloppy, they're not very smart, those kind of things. Instead, say, maybe I was unclear about my expectations, or maybe they didn't have the right tools or information, or, mistakes are a normal part of learning, and they're just learning right now. Let's talk about how we could do better next time. So we're taking away from some kind of character or intelligence or personality trait and saying it's a situational thing that can be addressed. And then for ourselves, we want to avoid justifying. Remember when I was justifying, I'm saying like, well, I've never done this before. Mistakes are a normal part of learning, or they didn't give me the right instructions. I'm using those to hide behind those reasons or those justifications for my mistake. Well, instead, what would be better is to say, I don't know that I asked enough questions. I didn't seek enough clarity. I didn't understand that well enough. Or I think the next time this situation comes up, I need to make sure I have a better picture of exactly what people want so that I can deliver it better. We're trying to take responsibility for our contribution and keep us out of this fundamental attribution error where we hide behind our intentions. And miscommunication happens. Rather than saying that they didn't tell me, or that's not what they said, or they didn't send the email, or they didn't read the email. So in the example of that's not what they said, a better way to think of it is, well, here's what I heard. So now we're not judging them and accusing them of lying or making a mistake. We're saying that's just not what I heard. It's not what I heard. Or you could say, here's what I understood. So we're putting basically the burden of understanding on ourselves rather than shifting it to them. When we didn't get an email, rather than saying they didn't send it, maybe I could say, I didn't see that email, or I don't have that email, or I didn't receive that email. That may be true, you didn't receive it. It's not necessarily true they didn't send it. There's so many things that can go wrong with email. And so it just may or may not have gotten to you. Now, just recently, I had an example within the Kevin Eikenberry Group organization. An email got filtered out by a spam filter. I have no idea how that happened. I don't know that it's ever happened before, but all of a sudden it did. Well, it's not that they didn't send the email. They said, I didn't get it, or I didn't see it because it was in my spam folder. And when we miscommunicate, when we say or do things, or another person doesn't understand what we intended, rather than say they weren't listening, maybe I could say, I wonder how I could phrase that better. I wonder how I can engage with them better. So what could I do better next time? Another side of that miscommunication is when we don't understand things and we try, or we're trying to justify our actions. And it sounds again like I told them, I sent the email. We try to justify that we did our part without looking at what we could have done better. So instead of I sent the email, they should have known, I told them, better ways to think about that or to talk about it would be, I wonder how I could have phrased that better, or I wonder where I was unclear. Is there something I could have said in a different way? Is there something I could have done to confirm they received that email? Maybe I could have followed up with a phone call to make sure they got it. Maybe I could have sent them a text message. I don't know. It depends on your relationship with the person, the communication modes you have available to you. Maybe don't trust email all that much. What could I do to make sure the message is easier to understand? That's another way to think about it. So basically, you're looking at what could I do to make the situation better rather than shifting the burden to the other person. Okay, so this bias, this filter, this fundamental attribution error is a problem because it allows us or kind of encourages us to justify our behaviors and judge harshly other people's behaviors and results. And what I'm suggesting is if you want to be a really effective communicator, if you want to speak clearly and concisely, you want to be well understood, and you want to understand well, then you want to be aware of this bias because we all have it to some degree. It creeps into our thinking frequently. So be aware of it, look out for it. And if you will work on using I statements, taking responsibility for what you can do to make things better, and when you're looking at how another person responds or what they did or didn't understand or what they did or didn't do, those kind of things, if you can consider that there might be some situational or circumstantial impacts on them that you're not aware of, and if you can look for the most charitable or positive or optimistic way to view how they responded to the situation, if you'll do that, remembering the caveats I said earlier that, maybe there are patterns of behavior that are different from one-off or isolated events. As a general rule, even in those patterned situations, remember I said that it's even then best to look at behaviors and results and stay away from assignment of negative character attributes. If you can do that, if you can use I statements in talking about how you contributed to a situation, if you can look for the most charitable or positive or optimistic way to view how another person responded to the situation or circumstance they were in, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.